Welcome back to a bit gamey and a history video on barbarians and what it's all about. What it's all about, Alfie. Sparked by the painting the unit of warlord Celtic warriors. A lot of people don't like, well, not a lot of people, but academics don't like the word barbarians anymore because it's kind of like rude and othering and all that kind of stuff. But I actually think it's very important. There's a distinction between barbarian and civilized. There's a practical distinction, I think, between barbarian and civilized, which ended up being one of the main dynamics in history for thousands of years. So it's important, in my opinion. So I'm going to talk about why. So when things start off, everyone is a hunter-gatherer, and as the name might suggest, they get their food from hunting and gathering. Note the temporary looking huts they got there. And the general pattern would be you'd have a little kind of clan territory, and if you sit in the same spot and hunt and gathering, you're going to run out of resources. So they're generally semi-nomadic. They'd have a camp for a while, and then do the hunting and gathering stuff, and then after 2 months, 3 months, however long it was, they'd move to a new site and set up a new temporary camp and do the hunter gathering again. If you think of like American Indians with their wigwams and teepees, or that's that kind of thing. It's temporary. And then, once they use up resources in that spot, they go to that spot, etc., round and round in a circle. So that's the general thing. That's like of each individual clan is like that. And then the next layer above that, you've got your tribe. Say this is the tribal area now, and the red circles represent each sub-clan, all doing their kind of semi-nomadic thing, wandering around from camp to camp within their own territory. And the other thing about that sort of this stage of development is they'll often have some kind of central spot where all different clans from the tribe would gather for like a religious festival, or it's effectively the same as a kind of county fair where you decide legal disputes and arrange marriages and all that kind of stuff. So that was the general state of play everywhere. You've got tribes with their own little centralized religious holy site, made up of a bunch of separate clans, most of which were semi-nomadic. And it's not always true. There's some places where the food was particularly abundant, where they might have a permanent village, but generally, everyone's semi-nomadic, living around that kind of. And the central holy site didn't necessarily have anyone living there permanently, because obviously, there's no food. You have to spend all your time collecting food to do it. So this is just a temporary site where people would gather. As and when, like summer solstice or whatever it might be. So the next stage after that is farming. And the thing about farming, it can only start in places where, there's suitable crops. And so basically what you need, at least in the West, there would like wheat or rice or whatever. But in the West, it's wheat. And so farming is only going to start where wild wheat is available, and that's like in Mesopotamia. So you get some wild wheat, and then you've got the hunter-gatherers going out and collecting wild wheat to turn into bread or whatever. And at some point, this turns into the invention of farming as a thing, where people can actually have settle down from being semi-nomadic and have permanent villages where they grow crops. But it can only happen where the wild wheat is native. And secondly, after that, is once it's started, farming or crop farming can only spread to the regions where it works. It's no point you have crops. You can't go and grow crops in the desert, for example. You can't grow crops in the mountains. So you get farming start somewhere in southern Mesopotamia, and gradually spreads over, or maybe multiple places, whatever. But you start somewhere, and then it spreads wherever it can spread. This is the crucial point. There's some places it can't spread to, and other places it can. And this is what, this is the real in my opinion, this is the real distinction between barbarian and civilized. Because, in the places, like in the green places on this map, wherever it started, farming can spread all around this, or the green region. But, it can't spread in the desert. It can't spread through in the desert bits. It can't spread into the mountains to the east, or the mountains to the north. It can't spread to the deserts in the south. It can't spread to the desert to the east of Egypt. It can't spread to the desert south of Egypt, or a bit lower, but the desert to the south. So you've got Libyans there, Nubians there, various names for the people who came in out of Saudi Arabia. I think Amorites was one of the names. Might have got that wrong. You've got Zagreb up here in the north of the mountains. It's got Gutians at one point. Forget Lullaby. I think maybe there's lots of different names for these different barbarian tribes on the edges. But that's the key point about barbarians, is that it's not that they're stupider, or they're not fast zombies. They're just living in regions where early farming wasn't viable, and so you get this this initial distinction between the civilized places. These are places with the city states and the early city states, early towns, and the barbarians up in the mountains or in the desert. And I say this is the dynamic, in my opinion, that drove history for a long time. So why does farming make a difference? The difference is, in my opinion, is specialist labour or specialist artisans. Because when you've got semi-nomadic or whatever type population, there's not enough spare food to support people who do a particular job all the time. So you don't get professional potters and professional carpenters and professional blacksmiths, because everyone's out doing their hunting and gathering. Now, within a particular little family or clan, there might be someone who's a bit better at making pots or a bit better at making bows, and they do more of that. But generally they're all amateurs, because they're all they're all doing something else as well. They're a hunter plus doing a bit of making some bows, or they're a gatherer who also makes pots. So everyone's an amateur. Whereas as soon as you start farming and you're producing a surplus of food, that surplus can be used to feed specialists. And your farmer might spend 90% of their time growing food for their own family, and the other 10% is food they can trade for pots or bows or blacksmith stuff. So that's the distinction. Is civilization leads to cities full of specialist artisans. And so, civilization has one, it leads to a bigger population from hunter-gathering. You've got a lot more people. And the second, they've got better gear. They've got better equipment because they've got, professional artisans. And, that to me is the key thing. If you've got if you've got a food surplus, you can support professional artisans. And if you don't have a surplus, then you can't. And obviously it's a spectrum, so it's various stages in between, but that's the general thing. Civilized states, or civilized places, nations, tribes, whatever you want to call them, they'll have more people and they'll have better gear than the hunter-gatherers. The next stage after this, which leads into the kind of the proper distinction between civilized and barbarian. So although this is basically the same thing, you've got places like Egypt, with their city states, and you've got these kind of hunter-gatherer type tribes to the west and south and east, or if you're in Mesopotamia, mountain tribes to the north and east, desert tribes to the south. It's all a bit it's a bit kind of like the Wild West sort of thing. Like the people on the outside, they're fairly small in number, hunter-gatherers and such. So they're more of a nuisance than anything else. But then the crop farmers, the other thing they do is they domesticate animals. Cattle, sheep, goats, whatever. And over time, the hunter-gatherers on the outside of the civilized areas, they get hold of these animals, domesticated animals, either by trading or raiding. And these hunter-gatherer groups on the fringes turn into herders using these wild animals. And you have sheep and goats in the mountains, camels in the desert, etc. And the thing about herding is, one, it produces more food than hunter-gathering, so the herders, their population goes up. And that's the kind of second stage of this thing, which gets to the key point of where they become much more of a threat because the numbers are up and the herding. And then you get this dynamic that I've been talking about before, which is I talked about earlier, which is where civilized people there's more people and they've got better gear, but they're surrounded by these herder populations who are hostile, who raid them and stuff. And then whenever they get weaker, whenever civilized places gets weak for some reason, like after a plague or a civil war or whatever, you get this recurring cycle where these herder barbarians will take over. They'll invade and take over. Just happened dozens of times in history. It happened after the fall of Rome, but also happened thousands of years earlier. With places like Sumeria getting overrun by the Gutians, and it's I don't think it's entirely accepted who the Akkadians were. Akkadians with two K's. I personally think they were herders. I think they were like people from the sort of Amorites from the Saudi Arabia, herders who were living on the edge of the Sumerian territory. That's at least initially, and then at some point, probably due to some kind of civil war, they took over some of the Sumerian cities. And I think because the herder populations, these tribal barbarian populations, they're generally smaller in their population size. When they take over a civilized place, a region, they don't completely replace the population. They just kill off the elite and take the place as the new aristocracy. So that's what I'm saying about the core dynamic, and why the word barbarian, as a distinction, as a distinction, is worth keeping, because this dynamic was most of history until I don't know, Renaissance or whatever, so about 4,000 years. You got civilized states surrounded by barbarian herders, or civilized farmers surrounded by barbarian herders, and the barbarian herders would, I wouldn't say often, but they would regularly conquer some civilized region after some kind of crisis, and then they'd replace the elite with themselves, and then 200 years later or 400 years later, that happened again, and a new lot of barbarian herders would come in and replace the previous lot of barbarian herders as the elite. So that's one part of why I think barbarian is important, is the fact that generally speaking, civilization spreads only where crop farming is viable, and elsewhere it mostly turns into herders, and the herders are the barbarians. Basically, they're the people who live in places where that don't generally support enough. They can't support towns, cities. Civilization equals farmers equals cities, and barbarian equals herders equals no cities. That's my general thesis. And to slightly backtrack a little, when you think of the first city-states, they're actually very small. They're not much bigger than a large village. So it's just going to have say a few potters, a few blacksmiths, a few whatever crafts are there, carpenters, whatever. And generally, there's also it's centered around a temple. And which goes back to the previous point about the tribal area with a little central holy site that's in a place which has, it's not permanently settled. And I think often, the first city-states were in those places, built around that central holy site, where priests first, and then later various artisans gather around. I mean, in fact, if you imagine it's priests first in the temple, then it gives you a perfect reason why artisans would gather around that site, for building stuff to do with the temple. And it gradually spreads. But yeah, so the first these dates, it's going to be like a small town, large village. Not that many people, but it's got a wall and it produces specialist artisans. But over time, they get bigger, and you can, more stuff can be made. And again, over time, they just get bigger again and bigger again. But initially, they're very small. Eventually, very big. And that's the big distinction between civilized and barbarian is the one, more people, and second, more specialist artisans. So they have they have better gear, which is why barbarians in future periods they tend to have clubs and spears and axes, because it needs less metal. They need less metal. They've got less metal. They've got less specialist artisans, and so that's they tend to have more spears. Whereas the Romans or whatever, they can mass produce nice little swords. So to bring it back to the Gauls and northern barbarians generally, there's a thing called Floristic Regions, which is regions where they've got a similar enough climate that the same kind of plants will grow. So for example, and in the European context, you've got the Mediterranean region, which is all around the Mediterranean, Central Europe, Atlantic, Central Russian, Pontic. The Pontic and Trainian, that's where the kind of nomad sort of horse nomads, steppe nomads are based in. Mediterranean, obvious, blah blah blah. Anyway, so the thing about floristic regions and crops, they tend to have a latitudinal kind of limit. So the things that were like wild wheat that were developing or that were native to Mesopotamia, once farming was developed, it could spread east and west much easier than it could spread north and south, because it's got a similar sort of climate. So farming spread quite relatively rapidly west around the edge of the Mediterranean coast. It also spread east as well. But this is our particular area of interest. So you got crop farming spread around the Mediterranean, but it took a lot longer to go further north because of it's colder basically, and so that's how you end up with the civilized Mediterranean and barbarians in the north, because going by my same earlier thesis, in the north you can't produce enough food to support cities, whereas you could in the Mediterranean region. The Atlantic is slightly different in that it's because of the heavy rainfall that leaches the soil and it makes growing crops like wheat harder. So even when it went up north, it was still north from the Mediterranean. It still wasn't very suitable for the Atlantic coast. That was always behind basically on crop farming. Hence why they're so reliant on dairy, cattle and milk and cheese and all that jazz. So yeah, but in this early area we're talking about now with the Mediterranean, the classical era, you've got civilized around the Mediterranean and barbarian either to the north and the south. Basically, that's the general gist of it. And and the reason is they couldn't produce enough food to support cities. And later on, after when Rome conquered these places, they could transport food from the south to those, to support the legions. The towns the Roman towns in Britain or Germany or wherever, or Gaul, they were supported from the more productive regions in the south. And then after the Roman Empire collapsed, there was no longer moving this food to these places further north. So all the towns and cities all the Roman towns and cities just disappeared, basically shriveled up, because people here couldn't grow enough food to support towns. So this goes back to my general thesis that civilized equals farming, and barbarian equals herding, because you could still, you could raise animals in places which you couldn't grow crops. You've got cattle mostly in northwest, pigs in the northeast, sheep and goats in places like bits of Spain, because it's generally on the coast, only along the coast that was you had the Mediterranean climate. So you had this kind of relatively thinnish layer of civilization around the edges of the Mediterranean, and lots of bits which weren't. So, like for example, the Greeks, they had lots of their little city-states in the southern part, and they invented the word barbarian. I think it's supposed to be there's barbar as basically meaning like gobbledygook, people who couldn't talk proper language. But really, it's just herders. It's like sheep and goat herders up in the mountains were the barbarians, or Gauls, the cattle herders, or Germans, herding pigs in the forest. So that's the general gist, and that's kind of mirrored in when you look at the colonies around the Mediterranean. Like from Greece, you've got all these colonies around the edge. A place like Massalia, we got a Greek colony city on the coast, and a bunch of Gaul barbarians on the outside that allied to. And from a wargame point of view, these kind of places are kind of some of the most interesting places, like on the Crimea, where you've got some Greek colony with a bunch of hoplites and on the outside, and they're allied with a load of horse archers. But yes, and that's along the northern edge of the Mediterranean, and a similar thing with the and similar thing anyway with the Phoenicians. From there, mostly going around the southern edge of the Mediterranean. So in both cases, you've got people from Greece going along the northern edge, and people from the Middle East going along the southern coast. So it spreads, but it all spreads in relation to the Floristic regions. And so that's why the Gauls were Gauls, or the Germans, and Britons. They were barbarians because they couldn't grow enough food to support cities. And because they couldn't support cities, they couldn't have specialist labour, specialist artisans, or they had some, but not many. A big chief might have one armourer guy making chainmail, whereas a Roman city might have 100 making chainmail. Which comes back to my original thing about my criticism of the warlord Celts, of having too many swords. Barbarians, they didn't have the specialist labour to be able to create lots of nice armour and nice swords and stuff. I mean, they had the brains. This is kind of my big criticism, because originally chainmail, for example, was supposedly invented by Celts up in I think around the Czech Republic, or what is now the Czech Republic, used to be called Bohemia. And they apparently invented that, and they were particularly good at making swords and all that kind of stuff. But they didn't have the professional artisans to mass produce it. Whereas the Romans, as soon as they got experience of chainmail, they just churned it out. To get to the point where every legionary has chainmail, where they're fighting people who maybe the front two ranks. It's just the chiefs and their bodyguards have got chainmail. So you've got maybe Romans in 8 ranks in chainmail versus Gauls, and the first 2 ranks have got chainmail, and the rest haven't got anything, apart from a shield. And so they lose. And this is again going back to the things why the barbarians will generally lose because of this, because of the civilized have got better gear. There's exceptions to that is when that the civilized regions are weakened for some reason. But I don't know if I explained it properly. But anyway, that's the general gist, that barbarians, or what the two critical distinctions between barbarian and civilized. And the first one is the civilized have got better gear. Well, it's 3 really. One, the civilized equals farming, and so they've got more people and better gear. And it's simple that, and they'll generally defeat barbarians unless they're weakened by something. But as I say, they can't. It's harder for them to spread outside of their core region, or they have to wait for technology to develop to expand outside of their core region. really kind of a hardcore empire like the Romans could do it, because they had the organisation to kind of feed their legions hundreds of miles away from the base. But most could only just prod away at the edges, build a fort here and there with a strong. And when they get weakened, it all gets burned down and taken off them. So yeah, so that's the first point about barbarians is it's dependent on climate and geography, basically. But say the point, the point I'm trying to get at is that when people portray barbarians in films and sometimes in games, they portray them as fast zombies, whereas for the most part they're just people who are living in places where they don't grow enough food to have cities. The second big distinction between barbarians and civilized follows on from what I think is the main point, which is that civilized basically means farmers and barbarian generally means herders. The thing about farming is you can't rustle fields. I mean, you could go with a bunch of mates to some enemy tribe in the middle of the night and harvest all their crops and take it home in a sack. But generally speaking, raiding is people wanting to get food for less effort than they would normally do. So what happens generally in a kind of civilized state with lots of farmers, all the kind of raider types, they'll gradually get sort of culled out of the population. Whereas in the herder populations, it's very easy to go and steal cattle or sheep from a neighbouring tribe, which leads to raiding becoming a way of life, particularly when you're running short of food. So the other thing about being herders, it leads to raiding, and the partly just because it's easier, but also there's another factor which is it still works today in some parts of Africa, and like in the Sahel, is when you've got a kind of herding culture, it's often like the chiefs or at least the heads of families who own all the cattle or sheep or whatever. And to get married, you need to give give some livestock to the family of the person you're trying to get married to. And so if a young man wants to get married, he needs some cattle or some sheep or goats or whatever. And if he hasn't got any, the way to get them is to raid them from a neighbouring tribe. And that's what they do. They get in these places in Africa. You get a load of young men to get together and they'll go and raid for cattle or sheep. And so if you think about that in a kind of evolutionary way, whether you believe in genetics or culture, if you've got a culture which says you can only get married and have kids if you're the sort of person who will get up on your horse in the middle of the night and go and steal some cow, then you're going to select for that kind of personality. The sort of bloke who just wants to sit at home with his mum, he's not going to get any cattle, so he's not going to get married, so he's not going to have any kids. So basically, herding selects for aggression and wildness and raiding. So although the way barbarians tend to get portrayed as fast zombies is I think mostly wrong, it is partly correct, I think, in that they and all these civilized peoples from for thousands of years have all said the same thing. They all complain about their local barbarians being particularly fierce and ferocious and warlike. And I think that's again the second aspect of this that's been driving or drove the dynamics of history for thousands of years is, farming gradually tames people because raiding is a problem. Raiding, it doesn't benefit anyone. It just causes trouble. Whereas the herder populations, raiding is a kind of way of life. And and they also say Greeks talking about Thracians and Sumerians talking about whatever, Amorites, and Romans complaining about Samnites, British complaining about Highlanders. It's always the same thing. You've got these people living in less fertile regions, mostly based on herding, or mostly because the thing is the barbarians did grow crops as well generally, where they could. Just wasn't as much as in the farming regions, and the farmers obviously had animals as well. But it's not really a black and white distinction between farmer and herder, but it's It's just a relative distinction. But anyway, the herders being, the barbarians being herders, and herders made them more kind of aggressive and warlike. So although there were fewer of them, and they had less gear, they had less equipment, less armour, they're still a significant threat because they were more ferocious. And to say it was, they did regularly take over civilized states. Whenever the civilized states were weakened, then the barbarians would come and get them. And one way of thinking about that is, if you think of human behaviour in terms of bell curves. Let's say the average, that's the average for a civilized population, and maybe like 2% are particularly ferocious, for example. Or maybe it's like it started off being here at the 13% mark, and then gradually over centuries they get culled until it's down to 2%. Whereas in the overlap, if the red line is the barbarian, the average of kind of ferocity, and that's the centre of the blue line is the average for civilized people, then there's a much more thing about it. It's not like all barbarians are ferocious. It's just that they're kind of outliers. The people that are, a couple of 2 or 3 standard deviations. There's just a lot more of them. So it might be like 2% of the civilized and 14% of the barbarians are like particularly ferocious. So you're going to get the outliers. Like in Norse, the berserkers in Nordic times and or Germanic times, and what get called Gesäte in the kind of Celtic times. I don't know if that was the word they used it for themselves, but those kind of guys who just go and fight naked, which is a shield, some kind of fanatical, ferocious thing. So I think those kind of fast zombie type barbarians did kind of exist, I think, but as a minority, you're not going to get regiments of them, or not generally going to get regiments of them. You might in some particular circumstance get regiments of them, but generally they won't be. They'll be like they'll be in amongst the chief's bodyguards or little clusters in a warband. So there's an element of truth in the fast zombie thing, but it's not generally true. The average ferocity, the average barbarian will be there versus the average civilized person there. And it's the people that are down on the far end on the right here that's going to be berserkers. So, conclusion: barbarians, two critical factors. One, they're the people who live in regions where they don't produce enough food to support cities, and so they don't have specialist artisans, or don't have many specialist artisans, and so they have less good gear, and there's fewer of them because they just don't produce enough food surplus, basically. So they're not necessarily stupid, and they're not all kind of crazy fast zombies. They just don't have they're not going to be civilized until they start to be able to produce more food. That's the first critical factor, and the second critical factor, right? And also, and going back to that, less armor, less swords, more spears and axes. And the second critical factor is that kind of evens up against the civilized. They are more ferocious on average, better fighters on average, because one of the things about herding is that it lends itself to raiding, both for just general raiding and also for young men trying to get stuff to get married with, trying to raid cattle or sheep to use to get married. So they're going to be more ferocious, but they're going to have less good gear, and it's going to be fewer of them. So, going back to the original thing with the Warlord Games Celts, you can have one or two kind of berserker types in a. You've got you can do a box of little miniatures for war games. Then if a box of 40 figures, you might have like maybe say 10% or like 4 or 5 berserker like dudes, who just look like they're just totally mental, and they'll probably be with the chief. I think one of the things in the Nordic things is quite often the chief would have a berserker, as one of their part of their bodyguard. So basically, because it just frightened, people like that just frighten everyone. So it'd probably be like, in a box of 40 figures, you could have like 2 to 4, say, berserker types, and you put them on the same base with a chief. And the rest are going to be, fiercer than the average civilized person, but but not fast zombies. And the second point, of course, is that they're not going to have as good gear. There's going to be fewer armour, less swords, more spears, more axes. So anyway, that's the end of that semi-rant. Oh, and there's an addendum to that. There's the third thing that I think people get a bit wrong with barbarians is that it's the numbers. I think it's the word horde gets people. You know, you say a barbarian horde makes you think the civilized people have been like massively outnumbered, and that's not really the case. I mean, a horde generally was a whole tribe. So, like in Caesar's Gallic War, it talks about right at the beginning. It talks about some tribe came over the Alps. It's a horde, but it's a whole tribe. So it's like 80,000 people, but that includes all the women, children, and old people. So the number of actual fighters is maybe 20,000, which is not much more than a standard consular legion. Consular legion of Rome is 2 Roman legions and 2 allied legions. So that's about 16,000 plus some cavalry. So it's not like the barbarian hordes are really huge in numbers of fighters. I mean, they're huge in terms of total numbers, but like I say, it includes all the women and kids. So I think that's another thing that kind of people hear that word, barbarian horde, and they imagine it's they get an idea. I think it's maybe from like situations like in the later imperial time, European colonies, where you had these small European armies going and fighting some tribal group, like Zulus or whatever. And they got a very small army, trying to put down a rebellion amongst a tribe, and they're really they're very outnumbered, but they've obviously got guns. I think people have that idea about barbarian hordes, but generally it wasn't there. There was a large tribe, but only the number of fighters is maybe 20 or 25%. So they're not they didn't really have the advantage of numbers. They had the advantage of ferocity and a disadvantage of lack of armour. Anyway, so yes, okay, to a little bit.